We live in a world which is very divided, where a lot of people don't talk to each other anymore. And I think exhibitions and art institutions are a great place where that can actually change, where we can bring people together. And I think it's one of the tasks today institutions have.
Hey everyone, on this week's episode, I sit down in the studio with the Swiss-born, London-based curator, art historian, and Serpentine Galleries artistic director, Hans Ulrich Obrist. Among the most prolific and everywhere all-at-once people I've ever met, Hans Ulrich is the author of dozens of books, including, most recently, Life in Progress, which just came out in the UK and will be released in the US next spring. He has been curating shows around the world for more than 3 decades now, and as you'll hear, is a reference machine. On that point, I highly recommend you check out the episode's transcript on our timesensitive.fm website, which features hyperlinks to many of the names, exhibitions, books, and other things we talk about. It may be the most reference-filled time-sensitive episode we've ever done, and that's as it should be, pure Hans Ulrich. His mind, as with his work, traverses boundaries and goes into many realms and down various rabbit holes, from art and architecture to fashion and design, to philosophy and technology and music, to writing and poetry. Hans Ulrich is a polymath in the truest sense of the term and an autodidact whose path as a curator has been shaped by his deep internal sense of purposeful urgency, an incredible skill at making myriad across-time connections and present-day key introductions, and importantly, actualizing ideas. On the episode, among many things, Hans Ulrich and I talk about what he's learned from his thousands of conversations with artists, architects, and others shaping culture and society, as well as his peripatetic path from a sheltered upbringing in a small Swiss village to his post in London at the Serpentine and vast presence across the art world today. We also get into 25 years of the Serpentine Pavilion, which has become a defining annual moment in culture globally and a springboard for many of today's leading voices in architecture, including Frida Escobedo and Lena Goetma, and his firm belief that we all need, in a certain flaneur sense, more promenadology, or strollology, the science of a stroll, basically, in our lives. Before we get into the episode, I'd first like to thank our Season 12 presenting sponsor, the high jewelry maison Van Cleef & Arpels, which this year is collaborating with the American Museum of Natural History in New York to present the exhibition Cosmic Splendor, Jewelry from the Collections of Van Cleef & Arpels, an awe-inspiring assemblage of jewelry creations, timepieces, and precious objects with astronomical references from the Maison's patrimonial collection, as well as from private loans. From dramatic necklaces depicting rockets in flight, to gem-encrusted pendants inspired by distant nebulae, to watches with intricate mechanisms that trace the transit of planetary bodies, Cosmic Splendor features nearly 70 astrological, celestial, and mythological creations that celebrate the wonders and mysteries of the cosmos. Among the enchanting universe of pieces on display are a yellow gold and ruby moon pendant from 1969 that's a celebration of the Apollo 11 moon landing, a yellow gold zodiac bracelet from 1973, and 2021 double galaxies clips, characterized by their evocative swirling designs. These works trace the stylistic evolution and the level of expertise that the high jewelry maison, founded in Paris's Place Vendôme in 1906, has developed throughout its history. You can purchase admission tickets or learn more about Cosmic Splendor at amnh.org/exhibitions. That's amnh.org/exhibitions. And now, here's my conversation with Hans. Hello, Hans. Welcome to Time Sensitive.
Hi, how are you? Great to see you.
Yes, and at long last, I mean, I feel like this conversation has been a long time coming. When we ran into each other about a year ago at Art Basel Miami Beach, I'd told you about this podcast, and you instantly had about a dozen references rolling off of your tongue about time. So I should say here that we're having this conversation at 8 a.m. on a Saturday. So it's fairly early in the morning, but technically not early enough for your brutally early club.
Yeah, that's true. The brutally early club was actually always at 6:30 a.m. It happened because I moved from Paris to London in 2006. And I kind of realized that it was complicated to plan meetings with friends when I always had to plan them a long time in advance, because also the distances in London are just so much bigger. It can take easily an hour to get from one part of town to the other part of town. And then somehow it's difficult to improvise gatherings. But I think the best gatherings are still the ones we can sometimes do impromptu. So we were with Schumann Bazaar, Markus Miesen, thinking, how could one do this in London, where we couldn't just say, let's meet at midnight at the Café de Flore. That sort of thing didn't work, so we had to plan it. But then we thought, if we do it at 6:30 a.m., nobody can say that they have prior schedule. And it kind of worked. People did really all show up, and it was also a club without the fixed sort of home, so as to say, without the fixed place, because we just had to find cafes and coffee shops which are open at 6:30 a.m. And that actually was anyway quite interesting to see what was open. I mean, Bar Italia in Soho, which is such an important place for art in London, and so many artist meetings happened there. The Bar Italia is, of course, open 24 hours, so Bar Italia was always a venue. And then at a certain moment, quite a lot of artists complained that it's actually not a good idea to do this at 6:30, because if we would do it slightly earlier, then it would work for early risers, but also for people who go to bed late. It would sort of be more an overlapping, so people could come directly from a club or from a party, wherever they are, and then, those who go to bed earlier, like me, they could then get up at 3. And so we did the hyper early club at 3:30. And that, again, led to a very interesting kind of choice of places, what is open at 3:30 a.m. in London. And one of our favorite places became the coffee shop next to the railway station in St. Pancras, which is basically an extremely busy coffee shop all night long, for people who missed the last train.
Well, I'm thankful that this isn't the 3 a.m. version of that. But I guess speaking of this particular moment in time, it's Saturday, December 6th, 2025. I wanted to bring up the architect Frank Gehry, who passed away yesterday at age 96. You've done several great long conversations with him, featured in your book, Lives of the Artists, Lives of the Architects. You've collaborated with him on the 2008 Serpentine Pavilion. Could you just reflect a bit here on your time with Frank Gehry and its impact on you and your thinking?
Yeah, it's important to remember Frank Gehry today. And in a way, we've probably recorded about 15 conversations with him over the years, and very often we saw him with Bettina Korek in Los Angeles. It's also how we met.
Yes.
But then also, of course, because I'm senior artistic advisor to Luma in Arles, and worked very closely with Maya Hoffman from the very beginning on this project of Luma Arles. And of course, Maya commissioned Frank very early on at the very beginning of the project. I always remember she organized a meeting actually in Zurich of the core group, which together with her thought this new institution with Tom Eccles and Beatrix Roof. And then also she had 2 artists in this group, Philippe Pareno and Liam Gilligan. And so we gathered in Zurich all together, and she told us that she had actually commissioned Frank Gehry to do the building. So it really began with that. So it's kind of Luma Arles began with this project Maya did with him. And so we obviously also saw him a lot there and did many conversations. I remember we did an exhibition with him when the building was under construction. And because often it's interesting when a new institution happens, what happens in the prefiguration, what happens in the process. And one exhibition was that we had a conversation with Frank, and he said, why don't the models move? And then we basically had Tino Segal, and also several artists were involved in this show. Again, I think Liam Gilligan and Philippe Pareno were involved. We basically started to move the maquettes. Tino developed the choreography for Frank Gehry's maquette, and they kind of danced through the space. Yeah, and Frank said we need a soundtrack for this show. And obviously he had this deep connection to music. Music was so so important for him.
Not just Walt Disney Concert Hall, he loved music.
He absolutely loved music, and he once said, he wrote this for my Instagram, because I've got this Instagram with the handwritten notes. He wrote, if architecture is frozen music, is music liquid architecture? Which is a great quote. And he somehow, I asked him who could be the composer, and he immediately said Pierre Boulez. So I rang up Pierre Boulez, and Pierre Boulez was in his 90s. He was more or less the same age Frank Gehry was now, and was not in Paris anymore. He was in Baden-Baden, in this big empty house near the park in Baden-Baden. So I traveled to Baden-Baden and went to Sir Pierre Boulez and said to Mr. Boulez, Frank Gehry suggested that we have this soundtrack, and he said anything Frank wants. And so we did this conversation, and he came up with a very beautiful soundtrack for the show. So we have to imagine, the models dance through the space. There is a soundtrack of Pierre Boulez. And then there was another kind of prefiguration project where in the arena of Arles, with artists from the moon, the beach was basically with sand, a moon architecture and the beach architecture sort of transitioned, or went from one to the other. And it was really interesting that that sand later on then became part of the building. So there's so many, layers to that story.
Yeah, 15 conversations, as you said. I mean, that's one of the things I love about your work. It's these sort of deep ongoing dialogues, often that start in conversation and then manifest these physical or ephemeral things out in the world.
I found a few Post-its actually last night. I went through the archive. Frank wrote for me. One is inspiration, curiosity, which comes first. Another one is, this is my handwriting, this was my handwriting. And then there is also the one, it's a longer one, about the Barcelona Pavilion. He wrote, minimalism and simplicity get conflated. The Barcelona Pavilion is minimal and probably considered simple. But the convention, what does it say here? Can you read it?
Hans has passed me his phone. Minimalism and simplicity get confused. The Barcelona Pavilion is minimal and probably considered simple. But the connection, let's see. I actually don't know what he says here. Of MOO to wall if you... This is classic Frank because I can't make out his handwriting.
I can't read it either. It's so funny. But the connection... No, now I think I'm sure. I now I get it. But the connection of roof to wall... And then it gets complicated again.
This makes me think about all this rarefied time you've been able to spend with these many artists and architects and others who are no longer with us. From Philip Johnson to Louise Bourgeois to Etel Adnan. And I'm sure the list is hundreds, if not thousands. But how do you think about this precious time that you get to spend? And now that so many of them are no longer with us, what does it mean to you to have this sort of archive of conversation, these documents of your time with them?
Yeah, Etel Adnan, the great poet and artist, she always told me that we have to kind of learn to listen again and pay attention and listen again. And I think that's, in a way, what the project has been from the beginning. It's about listening, but it's also about thinking how these conversations could produce reality, because very often I basically ask about the unrealized project, and of course there is a very broad range of why projects are unrealized. I think we all have unrealized projects. Some are too time intense. I think that's probably one of the main reasons why projects are unrealized, that we just don't have enough time in our life. Friederike Mayröcker, the seminal Austrian poet and writer, I always thought she should have won the Nobel Prize for Literature. She's, for me, one of the greatest poets of the 20th, 21st century. Friederike Mayröcker, when she was in her 90s, told me once, I have another century of literature to write. I have a time problem. So obviously some of these, and she's written more than 100 books, but she really, had many, many more books she had in her mind. So time, sometimes there isn't enough time, but it can also be that a project is too big or too small to be realized. It can be that it's too expensive to be realized. It can also be that it's fully or partially unrealizable. I mean, Zia Ahmadjani wanted to make a sculpture from the Earth to the moon. The late American-Iranian artist who was lived in Minneapolis, and that's an unrealized project because it's kind of probably unrealizable or very almost unrealizable. Then some projects are lost competition entries because, I mean, obviously we know a lot about, because we started this conversation with architecture. Architects publish their unrealized projects. I mean, a long time before some of these buildings Frank Gehry did, could actually be realized, they were, unrealized projects.
They called it paper architecture, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think it's published, and then often through that, reality is produced. And I think with artists, we know very little what are artists or poets or novelists' unrealized projects. And so I find it always very interesting to ask that question. Some projects can also be censored. Doris Lessing always told me, there is also the projects we want to do but don't dare to do. I mean, I always had this dream of writing a novel, but I just always thought it probably would be really embarrassing, so I've just simply not dared to do it. So that's what Doris Lessing called a self-censor project. So within this whole range, of the unbuilt or the unrealized, it's always a main focus of my conversation, and then very often, I try to enable these projects to happen. So it's, in that sense, an important part, I think, of the conversation project. And I mean, the fact that today it exists as an archive of almost 4,000 hours is really thanks to Jonas Mekas, because when I was very young, in my early 20s, because already as a teenager I visited artists, I kind of had these train tickets and went all over Europe to visit artists by night train. And then Jonas Mekas, at a certain moment when I was maybe 20 or 21, he said, you will one day regret it if you don't have these conversations recorded, because you might not remember everything. And then we were sitting in a cafe in Paris, and he was there with his camera filming me whilst he was actually telling me that. And so, and then I said, but I'm a little bit too shy to do that. And he said, you don't really have to be, this doesn't have to be professional equipment, because it's really intimidating, professional equipment. It can just be like, it doesn't matter if the camera falls on the floor or if it falls from the tripod, or the more improvised it is, the kind of better it is, because it's relaxed. And then he said something else was really interesting. He said, and don't do only sound. You should also film it. And so then I went to a shop, I bought a little video camera. So that's also about half of, I don't film everything, but about half of it is filmed. So it really exists thanks to Jonas. And also, Jonas gave me another advice. He gave me the advice to be incredibly paranoid about losing archives. He basically said we need to always keep many copies, and so there are always many hard drives, because you can't trust the cloud. Because if there is a problem with the data center, the cloud isn't the cloud. It is actually somewhere a data center, and there's a problem with the data center. I mean, the other day, somewhere in France, a data center burned down, and actually a lot of people lost literally all their data. So, yeah, what Jonas Mekas said in 1991, when he said, that we need to somehow be paranoid about losing data, that's something I also took to heart.
Yeah, it makes me think of, there's the sound artist Bernie Krause, who went around getting field recordings of rare species of animals and bird all over the world, had this incredible archive of sound, and then there was a wildfire in California, it burned his house down. All of his original recordings disappeared, but I believe it was like the year before, I think because thanks to Cartier Foundation, actually, all of it had gotten archived digitally. So this incredible archive of sound of species, many of which no longer exist, would be totally gone had he not had it archived.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful work, and it's at the moment exhibited in the new Cartier Foundation in Paris. Actually, the Soundwalk Collective has made an installation with the archive, and it's incredible. It's saved because of that. It would have been lost.
Yeah. Well, one of the things about your conversations, too, that I wanted to bring up has to do with age, because you've made this sort of long effort to capture octogenarians, nonagenarians, centenarians. I imagine, obviously, this is for their wisdom. These are people who have lived many lives. Also for posterity. I mean, it is a record of their words and their thinking. How do you see it?
Yeah, I thought, growing up in Switzerland as a teenager, I kind of read Vasari, Lives of the Artists, Lives of the Architects. And I think that the reading of this book was probably the most important book of my adolescence, because I sort of read it and then I thought there might actually be some historic figures in our time, like Vasari wrote, and maybe we should look at their work. And then I started to kind of look at a lot of magazines and books. It was the 80s. I was a teenager in the 80s, so there wasn't the internet. So it was basically, I had to go to libraries. And then there was this very strange house, kind of an abandoned house in a park, because I grew up in a small town, Weinfelden, maybe 9,000 people lived there. So the town didn't really have a lyceum. Would that be a high school or what is it?
I guess so.
Kind of.
Yeah, school.
Yeah, it didn't have a lyceum, a school. So we always had to take the train in the morning and go to Kreuzlingen and Konstanz, which is basically 20 miles away, 15, 20 miles away. And so we had to basically go to school there, which was very interesting because it was basically the border town between Switzerland and Germany. And next door there was also Austria. So this idea of crossing frontiers, crossing boundaries, crossing, going from one country to the next became a daily practice, because as kids we would basically go for lunch to Germany. Or we'd always go to the movies in Germany. Like every day, we several times, crossed the border. And this kind of abandoned house really sort of felt haunted. So I asked my teacher one day, and the teacher said that it's actually the former clinic of Professor Binswanger, the famous psychologist who basically, he is the theme of Foucault's thesis, but it's also the clinic where Abi Warburg was treated and famously wrote his serpent ritual. And actually, the first time this important text was actually presented was in a lecture to the other patients at the end of his stay there. And so the teacher told me all this story, and it sounded like incredible. So I went to the library, and in a way, Abi Warburg became really a super important inspiration, because I read about his atlas. I was too young to fully understand it, but I understood that he had somehow created, that knowledge can also be produced through unexpected encounters. So I started to kind of buy a lot of, with my pocket money as a teenager, I started to buy these postcards, and I started to make these arrangements on cardboards, and then a little bit later on, I started to kind of put them in boxes and started to make my own kind of museum. And then a second, I would say, revelation happened, because I read about an exhibition of Claude Sandeau, and the Swiss railway system, again, it's the analog age, so it's the time where there were landlines. It's also a time where there was a train timetable, which arrived always in January, and it's a very thick book about every single train in Switzerland and every train connection, and also the train connections from Switzerland to other countries. And so I kind of started to plot fictitious journeys. I was very inspired by Robert Walser, because Robert Walser was my sort of childhood hero, and I read all his books. And he obviously, after his exile in Berlin, he went on a fictitious exile in Paris, and then he went into an interior exile in Switzerland when he went on these walks. So I kind of started to plan fictitious journeys already when I was like 12, 13, 14, always looking at this book where I could go. And I also started to, at school, passionately learn languages. I learned Spanish and also Italian and French and English, because I wanted to get ready to leave, which I think is when you grow up in a very small country, it's important, this idea that one prepares. Also, this is in a big city in Switzerland. I needed to kind of be ready to move to a bigger city. And then on the cover of the railways sort of book, on the timetable, there was always an artwork. And I think that's also curatorially something which is important for me until today, which is this idea that art can appear where we expect it least, that it doesn't just happen behind the doors of galleries and museums, but it actually goes as public art or through, dissemination into society.
Some of your earliest curatorial projects, right? Your kitchen, a hotel room, the sewer museum in, where was it, Austria?
Yeah. Yeah, like exhibitions in unexpected locations. I think very often I've been interested in, and still am, in this idea that we basically bring art to people who might otherwise not go to museums. Because, I grew up in a house where my parents wouldn't go to museums. I would never have discovered the portal of art if art wouldn't have come to me through, posters Keith Haring would do for the Montreux Jazz Festival, through the street art of the sprayer of Zurich, the legendary Harald Nägeli, or through the artworks of this outsider artist, Hans Krüsi. He's a very famous art brut artist who in the 80s, when I was a teen, he would basically be in Zurich, and he was a migrant worker who worked on farms, and he kind of, like Andy Warhol, recorded everything. So he recorded all the animal voices, and he recorded the sounds of the farm. But then he made lots of drawings of cows, and he also wanted to do cinema. We didn't have a camera, so he basically created these infinite cow drawings and created cow machines, and then you could turn. And this guy basically sold flowers at the Bahnhofstrasse in Zurich, and my parents would go sometimes there on a weekend, and so then we would basically see this outsider artist not only selling flowers, but selling little drawings of cows. So in a way, art came to me through that, and then through the cover of this timetable. And then I read that the artist Claude Sandeau, who had actually done the cover, had an exhibition. So I went to see it. I was 16, and I really liked it. And I thought, that's when I for the first time realized one could actually meet, not only, as Vasari said, there are great artists in art, but one could actually meet them. So I wrote him a letter and asked for a studio visit. And that then became, in a way, a chain reaction, because soon after I then was in the studio of Fischli Weiss, and then everything kind of unfolded from that.
Richter, Boetti, it kind of just unfolded.
Yeah, and so to come back to your question about the archive, at the beginning, it was never really this idea of a master plan of doing this big archive. It's a serendipity in a way. It sort of happened.
Mm-hmm. And back to your crossing borders thing too, right? It was just a series of encounters that led from one studio to the next in a way. I guess here, could you also, just taking more of a 30,000-foot view, let's say, when you think about the vast relationship between art and time, what comes to mind for you?
Pierre Huygens Philippe Barreno once created an association to liberate time. And I think that, art can be a portal to liberate time. I've always also thought that there are so many different ways to work with time differently, so that it's not a sort of a homogenized schedule where we have to fit in, but that we can actually think about time in different ways. I mean, the Brutally Early Club is one example for that. But I think there are many more, in a way, to kind of just use time differently. And I think it has probably to do... I was thinking actually when I wrote The Life in Progress, this more autobiographical book last year, I was thinking that maybe it has to do also with my accident when I was like 6. I was involved in this car accident. It was many weeks between life and death. And I think at that time, something really sort of profound happened, that I kind of suddenly became aware not only of the mortality, but also just of this possibility that, how precious every day is. And that maybe, we never know how many more days there is, that we need to kind of make the best out of every day, and that we need to get it all done. And so it kind of, I think a lot grew sort of out of that in my relation to time.
And it makes me think, you've said that you were effectively reborn in Fischli Weiss's studio, but I also think you were perhaps also reborn in a way in that moment, because going through something like that does shift your relationship with time in an instant.
Yeah, I think totally. It was a completely new life started after that, because I couldn't do sports and I was, in hospital for a long time. So then it sort of began also, my relationship to books began there.
Mm. And perhaps urgency. I mean, I think about this notion of what you said. I mean, if we're talking about urgency, we have to talk about time. And, you even have organized an exhibition called It's Urgent. This is, your favorite word is urgent, I would say. Could you maybe speak a little bit about this relationship between trauma or your experience and urgency?
Yeah, what through the accident happened is the urgency to just to do things and not to wait. But I think it's about working very much, I think, with different temporalities, because sometimes I think it's important, that we don't plan things too long in advance, that things can be improvised, that things can be instantaneous, that can be spontaneous. And particularly with exhibitions, very often if you plan with a checklist years in advance, by the time the exhibition happens, it's basically very static. So I think the idea that we bring in something, and that brings us then also to architecture, because I think a big inspiration, I think came from other fields for me. I mean, a lot of my work really changed through encounters with poets like Étienne Latnan. It changed through encounters with poets and writers like Edouard Glissant. And it changed through encounters with architects. And an architect actually of the same generation as Gary was Jona Friedman. And I met Jona also when I was very young at the beginning of my trajectory. And he kind of explained to me that he doesn't really believe in this idea of a top-down master plan in urbanism, that he believes in this idea that we need to have spontaneous moments because we never really know what people are going to do in a city. And he was showing me, he says, we can't know if the person now will turn left or right. There's a big sort of unpredictability. And so he was talking about this idea, and then he was sort of mirroring it back at my profession. He was basically saying that you're a curator with your checklists and your master plans, you should try to question that. And that opened again a whole new chapter because I started to think, how could I bring in self-organization, spontaneity, into my shows? But that doesn't mean that it's all related to urgency or speed or, because sometimes I believe to not work with time in a homogeneous way means that we can also go from the extremely fast to the extremely slow. I mean, Fernand Braudel's longue durée was always also a very important thing for me, this idea that we can work on a project. Because I felt when after the kitchen show, because I did an exhibition in my kitchen, which had over 3 months, 27 visitors. I had a budget of $300. And it was very DIY. Mm-hmm. And one of the visitors was the curator, Jean de Loisier of the Cartier Foundation. And he actually came to St. Gallen because Fischli Weiss had sent him to the kitchen show. He was one of the few people from outside Switzerland who saw that show. And I said, I had the car. I borrowed often this very old Volvo of my father and my mother. And so then I would say I can bring it to the airport. But then I forgot actually to put, food into the car. So that we stopped in the middle of the highway. And so then we had this long conversation because he missed his flight. And then through that, I kind of got invited. We had a wonderful conversation. I got invited to this grant at the Cartier Foundation with him and Marie-Claude Beau. And this was that was another life-changing kind of moment.
I just love this, though. You basically got invited to the Cartier Foundation because of this conversation as a result of not having enough fuel in the car.
Yeah.
How amazing.
But then also, this was a great experience because the Cartier Foundation, it was very interdisciplinary early on because Marie-Claude Beau, there would be one evening, there would be a philosopher, another evening a fashion designer. So for the early 90s, that was very unusual in the art world. So it was really another, big opening for me. No, but that car I borrowed from my parents had another really important function at some point because I had just made my driver's license. And as you mentioned, Fischli Weiss were my mentors and close friends. And they obviously did this extraordinary artwork of the snowman which never melts. And it's now at the Bayerler Foundation in Basel, in Rien, and it's actually with solar panels. So it's not a waste of energy. It's fueled by solar energy, but it never melts. It's an eternal snowman. But this work in the 80s was originally commissioned for a power plant in Germany. And basically, Caspar Koenig, who was then the most well-known impresario and exhibition maker, was the curator, and Fischli Weiss was basically meant to make a proposal. They were late with the proposal, and it was Thursday afternoon, and the dummy for the snowman, made it in polyurethane, the dummy had to be in Saarbrücken on Friday morning. And there was just no way any kind of courier service could bring it, and they couldn't do it. So they rang me and they said, don't you have, sometimes, they knew that I just made my driver's license. They said, could you borrow the car of your parents and, drive this dummy, this, maquette of the snowman to Saarbrücken? So I said, absolutely. I took the car, went to Zurich. They put the dummy of the snowman on the passenger seat, so with a safety belt. And then I drove all night to Saarbrücken. And I arrived at 6 a.m. and I had the coffee. And then at 7 a.m., the legendary Caspar Koenig kind of, showed up on the bridge. I will never forget it. And we handed him over. And, he obviously had appreciated the effort of driving all night long. And so he invited me for breakfast. And that's how I then started to work with him. So that's how I got my first job.
The Volvo. Very important. How incredible. One of my favorite time references is from your book, Life in Progress, which was recently published in the UK and will come out in the US next spring. And in it, you write about your school teacher mother who had placed stickers all over her apartment with these different messages or aphorisms, quotes. You weren't quite sure where they came from, but her favorite was time lingers, time rushes, time divides, and time heals. I just love that.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, it was fascinating because when I began to travel a lot at the beginning, my parents were really worried. You know, when I was like 16, 17, I traveled all over Europe. So often they kind of traveled, they tried to travel with me. And obviously it became kind of complicated because I would always travel by night train. So it was too tiresome for them. And they also had to work. So ultimately they would basically accept the fact that I had to travel alone and all of that. But then I obviously was aware that they were very worried. So I read Serge Danet, who was always a big inspiration, the film critic. He said that he would always send every day a postcard to the parents, that would somehow be reassuring. So I started that as well. I would always send a postcard, but I would also always send my parents everything I would do. So if I do a lecture, I would send them the invitation card. If I would write the text for a magazine, I would send them the magazine. And obviously, at the beginning, most of my texts were kind of smaller contributions to bigger anthologies. The first couple of years, I didn't do my own books, so that I would send my parents the whole book. So what I didn't know initially is that my mother would really read the whole thing. You know, if there was an anthology of 1,000 pages and I would have one page, she would read all the 990 pages, 999 other pages as well. If I would write a little text for the Venice Biennale, she would read the entire thing. And that went on for many, many years. Then, when my mother turned 80, she actually started her own art practice. She started to make objects and would sort of hide them in the apartment so that they would sort of be visible and invisible. And it became a whole kind of exhibition.
It's incredible, too. In that sense, you were her portal into the world of art. This traveling on the train was also giving her access to a world she never had before.
Yeah, that's kind of what happened, yeah.
Wow. Bringing up your mother, one of the things that really moved me in your book was, and this was Rosemary Trockle, I believe, who had told you, make sure you have conversations with her before she passes. So you went and she was old and ill at that point, and you went and had these conversations. What was that like for you?
Yeah, Rosemary gave me a lot of advice also, because I think what happened is, because I was so young, I was like 16, 17, and I would show up in these studios, the artists kind of all felt they had to somehow give me advice or tasks, you know, because I didn't know, I just knew that I was really passionate about art. I didn't know exactly what I one day want to do. And so many of the artists felt that they somehow had to, it was almost like a mentor relationship, and they sort of gave me ideas, and actually many of them gave me tasks. So Alighiero Boetti would give me the task to basically ask artists about their unrealized projects that came from him. Fischli Weiss gave me another task that was quite at the beginning. They basically said, you know, in Switzerland, there's a lot of art from all over the world, because this Art Basel, they said you should actually go to Basel for 2 days and look at every single artwork at the fair, take notes, and then tell us what you liked. So it was a good exercise. So they all would give me tasks. And Rosemary gave me a very interesting task also, which I continue until today, because she basically said that, because, you know, I was like 16, 17, and she was 33. So she said it's fantastic that I would visit a young artist like her, and I should always continue to do that because young artists need support. But I should be aware, she said, that there are many extraordinary artists from previous generations who don't have the visibility they deserve. And she was particularly emphasizing female artists who have been working for a long, long time. And it was just the beginning that Louise Bourgeois started to be well-known in Europe. And I mean, she had her first sort of museum shows in the 80s, early 80s in New York, and then in the mid-80s it started in Europe, very late in her life. Rosemary said, this is wonderful, but there are many other artists who basically should have that visibility. And so she basically said, just ask that question when you meet young artists. Who inspires you? And so I took a night train from Cologne. I went to Vienna. The train arrived. I went to see a group of young artists in the Riva studio, and I asked them that question. And they all immediately said, it's absolutely the Louise Bourgeois, basically, of Vienna, is Maria Lasnik, who at that time wasn't known at all outside Austria and Germany. She was the extraordinary painter, filmmaker, animator who lived for many, many years in New York and did incredible work here. So I rang up Maria Lasnik and I went to see her. And I mean, until today, for example, for us at the Serpentine, at least once a year, we have an exhibition which has to do with that. We call it, the series is called The Protest Against Forgetting. And, basically extraordinary artists, for example, this year Arpita Singh, who is an artist in her late 80s from India, who is very well known in India, inspires many young artists, but it's been her first museum show in Europe. The same, happened with Kamala Ibrahim Ishaq, an extraordinarily influential painter, one of the most influential painters from Africa, who's basically in Sudan, and we did her first retrospective. And years earlier, of course, 10 years or longer before, it would be the same with Ete Latnan or Faith Ringgold when we did the first kind of bigger museum show of faith in Europe. So in a way, it's not only that artists, when I was a teen, gave me these, tasks, but very often, actually, in many cases, I continue them until today.
Yeah, you still have mentors.
Yeah, every day.
I love that. Maybe just speak a little bit, or just go back to this time with your mother too, because, I think it's amazing that you have this thing you do, these conversations with artists, and then to have the conversation with your mother. How incredible.
Yeah, it was basically Rosemary's idea, because she says that it has also to do with the fact that she said that we might, when somebody passes away, we then at a moment don't remember so much the voice, and it's important that you have this possibility to listen again to it. And and the conversations were very far-reaching. I mean, she told me through these conversations many things I had simply not heard before, about the family, about her parents, about my father, many, many stories.
Hey everyone, taking a quick break here to tell you a little bit about our Season 12 presenting sponsor, the high jewelry maison Van Cleef & Arpels, which this year is collaborating with the American Museum of Natural History in New York to present the exhibition Cosmic Splendor, jewelry from the collections of Van Cleef & Arpels, an awe-inspiring assemblage of dozens of jewelry creations, timepieces, and precious objects with astronomical references. Featuring nearly 70 celestial, mythological, and astrological jewelry creations that celebrate the wonders and mysteries of the cosmos, the exhibition presents an enchanting universe of jewelry from the Maison's patrimonial collection, as well as contemporary creations, some of them on loan from private collections. You can purchase admission tickets or learn more about Cosmic Splendor at amnh.org/exhibitions. That's amnh.org/exhibitions. And now, back to the episode. So I want to bring up the Serpentine. I can't believe we've barely touched on it. But this incredible, I don't know what to even classify the Serpentine as, because it's not a museum. It's many things. It's a sort of cabinet. It's this incredible vessel within Hyde Park in London. And you've been there since 2006, so nearly 20 years at this point. Tell me about your time there. Like, how would you classify your Serpentine time? How do you think about this period?
Yeah, the Serpentine time is exciting, and it really grew out of the Paris time, because, I mean, we've mostly spoken about the beginning so far.
Yes.
And at a certain moment, I basically had this grant in Paris, and then through that got a job at the Musée d'Art Moderne and became the migratory curator there. So it was basically a new job they created for me. And my role was to migrate and bring ideas from outside into the museum and do exhibitions in the museum, which happen in unexpected locations in the museum. So a migratory program, so as to say. That was with Suzanne Paget. And I did that for many years. And at a certain moment, I felt around 2000 at the museum that I wanted to do more at the Musée d'Art Moderne, because I felt as an independent curator, one would always do group shows. And I felt it would be really interesting to go deeper with artists, no? Because I think, in a way, it's maybe a very deep relationship working relationship one can have with an artist when one really works for a year or two on a monographic solo show and can just deepen this dialogue. And it felt the time for that had come. And that is really something which then, I took more institutional responsibility in Paris, and that then led in 2006 to the invitation that Julia Peyton-Johns invited me to join her at the Serpentine. And I would say there were many reasons for that. I felt that the Serpentine's park connection was so exciting. I always felt museums and institutions in a park are magical. The same is true for the Bayerler. Or I've always been also very fond of the Louisiana Museum. I love that museum. It somehow connects to parks, to nature. At the Louisiana Museum, it's the sea. Then, of course, I would say the idea also that it's not a huge building, it's a former tea house, so the artist can take it over and kind of create a Gesamtkunstwerk. There is nothing else to distract from it, right? It's basically a takeover when an artist does a show there. The sort of blurring between inside and outside, I always felt very interesting. This year, our CEO, Bettina Korek, and I and our teams did an exhibition with Giuseppe Benone, and it was basically the trees in the park, and then his trees he brought, and then the park came into the building, and you had the scent of the leaves inside the gallery. And Benone said something very interesting. He said he really wanted to connect the outside and inside because he loves the fact that people just walk in and there isn't really a threshold because it's free admission. And I think, to go back to this idea, how art came to me when I was a teenager, not from a family who has access to art. It happened because of free admission. It happened because I didn't have to basically pay a ticket to see the street art of Harald Nägeli or the little drawings of Hans Kusi, who sold flowers, or the artwork on the cover of the timetable. And I suddenly thought wow, the Serpentine is actually like that. It's a museum, it's an institution, it's a Kunsthalle, but it has free admission. It's like the park. It's like a common. People can just come inside. And very often people also, they don't even know what is inside. They're just curious. And then suddenly they get hooked and get into art. Some years ago, a taxi driver dropped me. I came back from a trip really early. I went to the office at 7, and obviously the taxi driver thought at 7, it's not opening hours, so probably this person works there. So he asked me if I worked there. I said yes, and he said that he always wanted to talk to someone who works at the Serpentine because his daughter, he wanted to tell the story of his daughter because they came on a walk on a Sunday, and all of a sudden the daughter ran into the pavilion and had a basically revelation and now studies architecture, and he kind of wanted to thank us, and he wanted to thank us particularly because he said, she would never have seen it because he always told his kids, museums are not for people like us. So she grew up basically in a household again, where there wasn't art. So because we do these pavilions outside the gallery and they never have doors, people can just walk in, they can stumble across it, and I believe in this idea that architecture can transform us and that it can create these extraordinary experiences, which I think why I get out of bed in the morning and to kind of enable people this experience or to make this experience possible for people. I was excited about that with the Serpentine, that it has this free admission. I was also excited about the architectural dimension because obviously coming from Vasari, for me, art and architecture was never really separated in that sense. I always had that book, Lives of the Artists, Lives of the Architects. But in Paris at the Musée d'Art Moderne, I couldn't really do architecture. And I remember we had lots of discussions in Paris about exhibiting architecture. And yes, I could have done a show of architecture there, but I always felt like to exhibit maquettes of architecture or drawings is not the real deal. When you show art, you don't show documentation of art, you show the art. So then I thought, if you show architecture, you need to show the architecture. And I was always super obsessed by the Barcelona Pavilion, to come back to that. And I was thinking, the project which Julia started with Zaha Hadid in 2000,
the Serpentine Pavilion.
Yeah, commissioning a pavilion every year. It's this incredible thing that an institution can be a client for architecture every year. And that was definitely one of the main reasons I got so excited, And then, of course, London as a city. I was already in the 90s when I was in Paris. I did a big show on the London art scene. That was the kind of first time I sort of tried to do an exhibition between organization and self-organization because we did this show Live Live. And we basically, at the Musée in Paris, brought in these amazing artist-run spaces from the 90s, City Racing and others, transmission from Glasgow, from different cities, and they would self-organize their show. And our show would be a sort of a bridge between all these self-organized entities. And so I had already spent a lot of time in London then for research. So yes, and then of course the pavilion became very exciting because we continued for several years what Julia had started, which is basically, and the rule of the game was always the same, that it's the first building of an architect in the UK so that it brings in new voices. Even if London is an incredibly international city for architecture, and even London has these extraordinary architects. It has produced amazing generations of architects, as we know, but not many architects from abroad actually built there. There were so many projects which never happened. So a lot of international architects just didn't get to build there. So we could basically do the first building of Sejima and Sana, Nishizawa, the first building of Gehry, of Niemeyer, of all these architects in the UK. And then after about, I would say 12 years into the scheme, 6 years into my time in London around 2012, I remember we started to think, first of all, we've worked with most of the really legendary architects who had not built in the UK. But we also saw a new generation of architects emerging. And we also realized that the scheme had become quite well known and established, because we always wanted to do something which is not, it's not like an art institution doing something by bringing in architecture, but it's something which had to matter for the architecture world. And the pavilion had to started to be really well known, not only in the art world, but also in the architecture world. So we thought very practically we could actually use this to basically enable younger architects to have more visibility and do similar things we do with exhibitions, where very often we would do the first museum show, the first institutional show for younger artists, and do that with architects. And the first younger architects we did this was Su Fujimoto, and it's been going on ever since. Yeah, we hope that it's useful, because I always think, that's a key question with projects also, how useful they can be for the world. And I think in a way, particularly now also, it's such an important moment in architecture for the architecture world to be more polyphonic, more diverse, and very importantly also that there is just more visibility for female architects. And that's something which over the last couple of years, we're very happy to have worked early on with Frida Escobedo. Before, she worked really outside Mexico. She had mostly done installations, also internationally. She had done this amazing installation for the Design Biennial in Lisbon, this disc. And I remember I passed by there one evening, and like so many people used it in different ways. And I thought, this totally reminded me of Serpentine, this idea of it being for everyone. And so we invited Frida, and Frida soon after won the competition for the Met and now the Pompidou. And
she designed the building we're sitting in.
Which is kind of amazing, And then the same with Lina Gottme.
Yeah, who's been a guest on the show, actually.
Who now, exactly, I saw that, and who now does the British Museum.
Yeah.
And the first pavilion, new pavilion in the Giardini since South Korea, which is going to be the Qatar Pavilion. Then, of course, also Sumaya Wali, who's the youngest architect we've actually featured, who now has this important bridge project in Belgium and also works all over the world. And then I think this year we were very, very delighted to work with Marina Tabassum, who has done fundamentally important work in Bangladesh, but has basically places for gathering, but also architecture addressing the climate emergency with her Kudibari project, but had not really built outside Bangladesh. And for us, is really one of the most important architects of the 21st century.
Yeah, what you're saying is so incredible, because you were working with, as you said, the Zaha and Frank Gehry and Peter Zumthor and these sort of legendary names. And then it sort of evolved into this platform for more emerging talent. And what's interesting, I think, is that in architecture, until the Serpentine Pavilion, I don't know that there was such a, back to time. It happens every year. There's a sort of ritual to it. It's recurring. And it's interesting to me that architecture, as one of the slowest arts, has this platform that allows a sort of dialogue to occur in time that otherwise wouldn't really occur without it. I'm curious to hear your take on that, because to me, it is interesting how, just to use Frida Escobedo and Lina Gottme as examples, like they were already on a certain upward trajectory, but this platform really gave them another spark. It gave them another opportunity to showcase their thinking in real time.
Yeah, I think it's got to do with the fact that maybe it's an experience, because one can actually experience a building of theirs, and it happens in a very, very central location where a lot of people see it. So I think it has also got to do with that, because in a way it's hundreds of thousands of people who visit the Serpentine Pavilion. And so I think in a way it in that sense has probably more visibility than a lot of other commissions, an architect could do, which maybe are bigger. Even if it's small, it is very, very visible. And I think also pavilions allow to experiment, because there are, of course, there's a brief, and it needs to function within the brief, but a pavilion has a lot of freedom, because it's not a permanent building. And I mean, one of the things which is in our brief is that it needs to be repositioned later on. It always has to have a second life, because otherwise it's not sustainable. So each single pavilion, goes on somewhere.
Right. Frank Gehry is now in the south of France.
Yes, and then the Su Fujimoto, the first younger architect we did, is on the central square in Tirana. It belongs to the Luma Foundation and is now in Tirana. Smiljan Radic is in Somerset, House and Weird. I mean, basically, many of these pavilions, the Bjarke Ingels, the big, is in Canada. Many of these pavilions develop a second life, and we have a couple of exciting announcements coming up for next year, because next year is the 25th pavilion. This year was the 25th year, but next year is the 25th pavilion, and there will be some exciting announcements of some pavilions from the past which will reappear. And of course, also this year, for the first time, we also had a play pavilion. We had a second pavilion, which is a play pavilion, and that's for Bettina Korek, our CEO, for myself, for our teams. What is really, really important is also to foster new alliances with art institutions today. It's not only to build bridges, many, many bridges, but also new alliances and unexpected partnerships. Because obviously it's important for a museum to work with for an arts organization to work with other arts organizations, which is what we do. But it's important to also work with organizations of a different kind. And
right,
so,
you just announced this big partnership with the Flag organization. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, we are very excited about this collaboration with the Flag Art Foundation and Serpentine, where basically we're going to have an art prize, which will lead to exhibitions of the artists who will win the award both in London and in New York City. So that's a new alliance. Then, of course, the Play Pavilion was with the Lego Group. There's so many people in the world who are interested in Lego, so brought us a whole new audience. And we commissioned basically Peter Cook, the co-founder of Archigram, to do this Play Pavilion. He's always been interested in play. I mean, another example would be the collaboration we had with Acute and Fortnite, because obviously we also have that's something which is another dimension which is really key for us at the Serpentine, is this idea. And that's something goes back to your question from before. I was excited in 2006 to actually have this possibility for the first time to not only think about exhibitions as a curator in a museum, but also, by assuming more responsibility, think about how one can structurally change an art institution for the 21st century. And that means also to kind of insert or introduce new departments. For example, we had and continue to have a whole focus on ecology that began with Gustav Metzger, with the Extinction Marathon, with a lot of projects we have, until more recently, Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg developed a garden for us. It's the biggest artwork we've done in the park. It was a garden for pollinators, so assisted by AI. The designer and artist Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg developed a garden which really attracted an enormous amount of pollinators. And it was not for us humans, it was for pollinators. And with AI, Alexandra could basically determine which plants would work best, for the pollinators. So that would be a long durational artwork, which would in that sense, connect to environment. And of course, the other thing besides the ecology focus, which we introduced, is the experiments with technology. So with Serpentine Technology, it's a whole department. That means that we can actually produce video games, that we can work with projects, related to AI over the last 12 years. But there also, of course, it is about fostering new alliances with new partners. So we did this exhibition with Fortnite, Acute and Cause, and the Serpentine North was basically the Zaha Hadid building. The permanent Zaha Hadid building was rebuilt virtually on the landing page of Fortnite. And so we had, over 2 weeks, 152 million visitors who saw this digitally and became acquainted or familiar with the Serpentine. And of course, that led to the fact that thousands and thousands of teenagers brought their parents to the physical exhibition, and usually it's the other way around.
Hey everyone, taking another quick break here to tell you about our weekly newsletter, where I share a behind-the-scenes look into each time-sensitive episode, and where we also get into various things in the cultural sphere our team at The Slowdown is paying attention to. You could sign up and join our thousands of other subscribers by going to slowdown.media/newsletter. That's slowdown.media/newsletter. And now, back to the episode. I wanted to close our conversation with a long view question here, and I know you like long view questions. In your new book, you write, "This idea of a system with a longer time span is fundamental today for art in all its forms. We have to move beyond short-term thinking. We must think about objects that will last, contrary to the idea of fast fashion and design." So I wanted to ask, do you see art then as an antidote to short-termism in some ways? Does art help perpetuate ways of knowledge and thinking that eschew short-termism?
We always learn from artists, and basically making studio visits all the time. I've realized over the last couple of years that more artists are interested in doing gardens, in doing farms. I mean, I mentioned Alexander Daisy Ginsberg, but there are many artists who have garden projects, but also the farming projects are really interesting. I mean, there is, of course, near New York, the Dan Cohen's farm, but there's also Otobong Nakanga and Inka Shonibare, both independently of each other, have these art farming projects in Nigeria. Adrian Villarojas just told me yesterday about the farm in Rosario, in Argentina. So I don't think that that's true for all artists, but there is clearly a pattern there that more artists are interested in such long durational projects. And I think at every moment in time, we should always think not only how can we bring art into the institution, but how does the institution have to change in order to accommodate where art goes. And so I just think it's a very interesting challenge for the next couple of years to see how, with Alexander, we've actually built the garden. With Yinka, we've done an exhibition where we showed Yinka's different works, but then made a link to his farm in Nigeria. There was a whole room connecting to that. And so I do think that it's something we need to think about. So I would say that's one pattern right now I see. I think the other pattern that in a way connects is that we live in a world which is very divided, where a lot of people don't talk to each other anymore. And I think exhibitions and art institutions are a great place where that can actually change, where we can bring people together. And I think it's one of the tasks today institutions have. And if you come right now to London, to Serpentine, you can see two exhibitions. You can see the House of Music of Peter Doig. And the House of Music of Peter Doig kind of brings together the world of music and the world of painting, the world of art. And he creates a kind of a Gesamtkunstwerk in the gallery. Peter Doig's exhibition, it's a whole display feature with curtains and a new floor, but also chairs and tables, paintings, of course, importantly of Peter Doig, but then also sound systems, extraordinary speakers, which the world used to have in cinemas in the 30s and in the 50s, which have an amazing kind of analog, very embodied analog sound quality, and then Peter's record collections, but also a lot of guests. Lizzie Bugatzos is going to come soon. Brian Eno is going to come soon. They're bringing basically records and play their records, their vinyls. It's a kind of a celebration also of analog music, and a lot of things happening because people actually talk to each other. Because usually, in a museum, people would go maybe with some friends or alone, but it was quite rare that they would talk to a stranger in a museum. And here, all of a sudden, people sit down at the table, they listen, they meet new people. And that's also, of course, what happens with the pavilion every year. I mean, Lina Gottmik called her pavilion à table. Francis Queret, who went on to win the Pritzker Prize, when he did the Serpentine Pavilion, wanted the gathering place under a tree. It was basically, again, with Lina, it was the table. With Francis, it was the tree with basically with Theaster Gates, it was the Black Chapel. It was basically an extraordinary gathering place where Theaster created a Black Artist Retreat. Again, gathering, again, coming together, bringing people together, creating togetherness is I think, what is so important now. Or with Min Suk Chu, it was actually an empty kind of Korean madang which brought everything together. And I think with Peter Doig, it's an exhibition which tries to do that. We also have a show by Daniel Braithwaite-Shirley. I'm going to find the title here for you. It's the Daniel Braithwaite-Shirley show. It's called The Delusion. And it's a video game commission with a multiplayer immersive experience run on game engines. It really combines cooperative gaming and participatory theater. People can there basically address topics of polarization, of social connection. And again, it kind of leads to conversation. And that is something which, for Bettina, for me, for our teams, is really central to kind of enable that possibility for people to do. And that is something we can see globally, I think, with a lot of artists right now, that there's a desire to create, to bring things together, and so on. I think another point, which is maybe quite central and which is a pattern, is, and that brings us to something we haven't spoken about, which is my favorite topic, Edouard Glissant. Because during my Paris years, I met Edouard and we started to spend a lot of time together. And I would say from him, I learned a lot. And it goes back also to your long duration question. From him, I learned a lot about how in the contemporary world, in the 21st century, we somehow, working with exhibitions, working with museums, with art institutions, address the themes of globalization. And obviously, this is not the first time the world experiences globalization. There have been previous moments of globalization, but it's certainly one of the most extreme moments of globalization, fueled by technology. And Glissant always predicted that this will lead to homogenizing forces, the disappearance of languages. It will lead to the disappearance of cultural phenomena. Languages disappear at extreme speed, but also handwriting. It leads to my handwriting project, where I decided to basically dedicate my Instagram project to handwriting, because I felt that there was a risk that we don't use handwriting anymore. And again, it was someone who gave me a task, because I was in the apartment of Umberto Eco in Milano, and we did a conversation about archives. I always wanted Eco's take on archives. And at the end of the meeting, Umberto Eco had a key, a big key. It was a bit like In the Name of the Rose. I got a bit scared. He took out this big key and he opened the door and then led me to a secret room and locked the door behind us. And in the secret room, there were all these medieval, extremely old manuscripts, handwritten manuscripts he had sort of got from monasteries, and they were like time capsules. And he was very, very special. He showed me this basically library of rare books, and he said, I have this key because I don't want anyone else to enter. And then, he opened the door again and, said goodbye. And we were in the stairways, and he said, I am too old, but it's your job. You have to save handwriting. And then I didn't really know how to do that. And we were basically on vacation with my partner, Ku Jong-ah, the artist, and also with Simon Fatal and Etel Adnan, the artists and poets. And it was in Brittany, and it's always raining, often raining during Christmas time, during the holidays in Brittany. And I think it was sort of December, and it was raining so strongly that we had to find shelter in a cafe. And a few weeks earlier, Ryan Trecartin had downloaded the then new app Instagram on my phone. I didn't know what to do with it. And we were in this cafe and had a long conversation. And at a certain moment, the rains would not stop. And then the inevitable happened, that basically Simone and Ku and I would go on our phones and answer some messages. But Etel didn't have a smartphone, so she basically took out the notebook and wrote the poem. And that's when it all came together, because I suddenly realized I just took a picture and I posted it. And in a way, this idea what Glissant said, the homogenized globalization could make things disappear. But then, of course, Glissant understood early on, and that makes him such a premonition, that there will be a counter-reaction, that basically that the opposite of globalization will lead to new localisms, to new nationalisms, to new lack of tolerance. And he basically said that we need to resist both and find a sort of a mondialité, find a global dialogue which can listen, which can be aware of the dangers of globalization, but at the same time be tolerant, enable global dialogues. And I really think about that every day. So I think that's another pattern we can see. I think in a way we see a lot of art right now which thinks about this mondialité in a Glissantian sense. And anyway, many of the other toolboxes Glissant gave us, archipelago, creolization, the right to opacity. There are so many, in all the conversations I had with him, I felt I learned so much. And we can see it's amazing how many artists today read Edouard Glissant. Then I would say another, and of course, to apply Glissant, because I applied on a daily basis, leads also to longer durational projects. For example, my Do It project, which we did with Boltanski and Lavier, with Christian Boltanski and Bertrand Lavier, is a project made with instructions and recipes. And wherever it goes, it learns, it listens.
More than 30 years old now.
Yeah, and it's still happening. And it's basically very much also what Bernard Stiegler told me when he said, how can we be local without being localist? And that's kind of what DUI tries to be. And it's a project which basically is a long-durational, evolving learning system. And I've always been interested in such projects which they can somehow become repertoire. Like in theater, it would be repertoire. But as opposed to repertoire, it's always evolving, it's always changing. And it's almost like, in that sense, it does in an analog way what would happen with a video game digitally, right? Because, so many artists are now working with video games. And also with technology, we can see that more and more artworks are becoming somehow like living organisms. And then I would say a last point where we can also see at the moment a pattern is that more artists, I think, are interested also in public art. And of course, that also has to do that certain artworks maybe can stay, that we can experience them for a longer time, and I think there has been a lot of focus, I think, on exhibitions, but I think now I meet a lot of artists who are really interested. My partner Kouchonga started to do some years ago these skateboard park sculptures, which are both sculptures, but they're also phosphorescent skateboard parks actually skaters can use at night. And, once they're installed, they stay for a very long time. So I think that's something we can see. There's a lot of artists right now have also projects of houses, which is interesting. I've always been interested in house museums. I did shows in the Lorca house, in the Barragan house, Isabella Mora in the house of Lina Bobardi. And we spend usually a year in these houses, developing exhibitions with artists. And I find it very fascinating that right now, a lot of artists are interested in actually developing these houses as kind of a Gesamtkunstwerk. And then go back to Peter Doig's House of Music. Somebody asked me yesterday, there should be such a house of music as Peter Doig did it at the Serpentine, which, would be there forever.
Yeah. And I love also, you've said of curating exhibitions as having slow lanes. I almost feel like that's what art does too. Art is a portal into taking these different slow lanes, whether it's, wandering through a park and coming upon a public sculpture or, like your durational marathons are another example of what I would call a slow lane, where you just immerse yourself deeply in a world for a set period of time and then pop your head out again.
Yes, and maybe also both in an analog way and the digital way, it's about the flaneur. It's about, the serendipity of most of my projects where chance also is embraced. It's often a controlled chance, but chance is embraced. I began with Robert Walser, and Robert Walser went on walks. And I think this idea that we somehow need these moments of serendipity and of discovery, particularly in the moment where more and more there is this lock-in thing with the algorithm. And so we kind of need to create analog and digital serendipity and analog and digital promenadology. It's actually very beautiful that the Swiss landscape architect Lucius Burckhardt, who was a mentor of mine, he was also a mentor of Herzog de Meuron. And I should have mentioned that before, that actually at the same time when as a teenager with 16, 17, I started to visit artists, I met also, thanks to B.J. Kuriger, Jacques Herzog. She took me to the studio of Jacques Herzog. So in a way, Jacques Herzog planted and Pierre de Meuron, they planted the kind of seed with architecture, in me. And both Jacques and Pierre and also I were very inspired by Lucius Burckhardt. And I curated the Swiss Pavilion for the Architecture Biennale some years ago, actually celebrating two forgotten pioneers, Cedric Price and Lucius Burckhardt, through contemporary artists and architects. Lucius Burckhardt actually invented or defined a science at Kassel University called promenadology. I think Spaziergangswissenschaften. I think in English it would be strollology. it's the science of going on a stroll. So I firmly believe that we need more strollology.
Oh, man. What a great place to end. Well, I have one final question.
And actually, interestingly enough, yesterday, we spoke with Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, who are the artists who work a lot with technology. And, we did this exhibition with them called The Call, which addressed really societal concerns with AI and platform musical ensembles from all over the UK. So it basically looked at sort of choirs as a coordination technology and also the connection to AI. And they worked with different choirs all over the UK with a songbook, and it created a data trust so that the choirs co-own it. And so it's a kind of ethical use of AI. And yesterday, Holly and Matt told me that with vibe coding, more and more coders actually code whilst strolling. So there might be the vibe coding strollology.
All right, final question. And this is maybe a cliche way of ending an interview with you, but I didn't want to ask you the question you ask everyone, which is, do you have any unfinished or unrealized projects? But what I did want to ask was, of all the answers you've ever gotten to that question from everyone you've ever asked it, what are some projects that have yet to be realized that you'd like to make happen with an artist or an architect or otherwise?
There is such an immense, basically a very big archive of answers, of course, in these 4,000 hours.
Overwhelming question, I know.
And it's a fascinating question, because I always wanted to do an exhibition and a book on all the answers I got for this question, and it would be like a building, full of unrealized projects, which would hopefully allow people then to realize this project. But ironically, whenever we get close to realizing it, it falls through. So this is why I never really have, the mapping or the cartography, the Übersicht, the overview of all of them. I mean, I do think that Cedric Price and John Littlewood had this wonderful project of the Fun Palace, which they told me about. I mean, particularly John, the pioneer of street theater, sadly had passed away. But I did still meet Cedric, and in my many conversations with Cedric, he explained to me this incredible idea of a big kind of, it was of course an inspiration for Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano to do the Centre Georges Pompidou. And that was this idea of the Fun Palace, which was basically...
which, by the way, Frida is now doing the project on. It's so incredible.
Exactly, and we were actually... with Marta Minugin and Frida, I did a talk with Marta Minugin and Frida at Art Basel, Paris. I hope it's going to happen, because that's an unrealized project. I really hope it's going to happen, because Frida and Marta, I asked them about their unrealized project at the end, and they came up with this idea to do, whilst the Pompidou is closed, a very big inflatable. Marta Minugin does these public sculptures inflatable where you can walk in. They're very beautiful public art projects. So it would be Frida and Marta doing a big Pompidou inflatable you can walk in whilst the Pompidou is closed. That came out of the talk. No, but my real answer to your question is this Fun Palace, which is unrealized, where basically a theater performance can go into a lecture can go into an opera can go into a concert can go into an exhibition, where you can hang in all these different functions and where really all the disciplines can come together. And I think, in a way, it's been very difficult to realize that on the scale Cedric and also John wanted to do it, because I think it would be incredibly expensive to plan it on that gigantic scale. But I think it is interesting, because the pavilions are, in that sense, kind of mini Fun Palaces, because one day there is a film screening, one day they can go into a lecture, can then transform into a performance, can perform into a dinner, can go into many, many things. And
it makes me think, too, of Il Tempo del Postino, this incredible time-based project you did.
Yeah, that was an opera we did with Philippe Pareno and 12 artists, where we basically gave the artists time and not space. And that was part of the Manchester International Festival with Alex Poots. The idea was basically that it was an evening-filling program where every artist had approximately 15 minutes and they could work with an orchestra. So it was a kind of a polyphonic opera done by visual artists. And because the Fan Palace doesn't exist, it took us a long time to find an institution where it could happen, because museums don't have the space for that, because it needed an opera space or bigger theater space. And opera said, that's a museum show, we can't do that. But then when the Manchester International Festival got invented, the festival could actually, as an interdisciplinary organization, make that happen. And in a way, we then did also this prelude for the Shed with Alex, where we commissioned Kunle Adeyemi, the architect, to do a small pavilion on an empty piece of land in New York City. And this pavilion could actually open and close at all times. And so there would be a concert by Arca at night, and then just before there would be a choreography, Bill Forsyth, and then the afternoon maybe a concert of Abra, and then a conference, a scholarly conference, and things would just flow, into each other. So I think that was an example of that. But to actually really have it as an institution, as Cedric and John had imagined it, is kind of unrealized. I would say another project which has always been on my mind, unrealized, is of course many artists have always mentioned this idea that we might need a new Black Mountain College. And particularly at this point in time, this seems very important. And there is actually a possibility now that such a new school can happen, because I'm working on this project with Laureen Powell-Jobs and Abby Churchill, where the former San Francisco Art Institute, because that building was saved by Laureen, who now wants it, to be a school and be a sort of a residency, really, where artists, for young artists, and the idea there to sort of reflect upon what such a interdisciplinary school can be. And also, of course, it's important at this moment in time, thinking also about models. We're really listening for the moment, because this is in a couple of years, so we are listening to what artists think such a school should be. So it's, again, going back to listening, it's listening sessions. And it's interesting also to just look at models, which have existed. And for me, like when I moved to Paris, I came there as a baby curator with this grant at Cartier. And everywhere I went, were the repercussions of this little school, Pont de Sultan, Daniel Buren, and Sarkis and Serge Fauchereau had done, which was basically a room, slightly bigger than this room, but not much bigger, with a table. They would basically have young artists from all over the world, and every week there would be an amazing talk, and the young artists would meet somebody, and it was also really fascinating that the students not only did not have to pay, so it was free, but they were actually paid. So each young artist got a stipend to be part of that. And it just seems to really be extremely urgent to think about such models now, because that produced a generation. It allowed artists who never would have had the possibility to have all these encounters to grow, and not only did he produce basically my entire generation of artists, not only those who attended, but also their friends. Because I don't know how one would call this.
Reverberations.
That's the word. Thank you. The reverberations were so strong that, Pierre Wieg once told me that he didn't go to that school, but the reverberations, reverberations were so strong that he also felt like deeply inspired by that. And so, that's definitely another kind of important project. And that's, a project which I think there need to be many such models. We need many such schools in the world. And it's interesting how many artists actually over the years have mentioned that. Then I would say, in terms of the unrealized projects of artists, that there is also an amazing range of unrealized public art projects artists want to do. Because I think very often with public art projects, radical projects don't necessarily win the competition. That's why I really hope that we can one day make accessible the archive, because I think many of these projects, should still somehow, be realized.
Well, Hans, thank you for coming, and I'm hopeful that many of the reverberations of this conversation will continue for those listening for a long time to come.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to see you.
Extra thanks to our Season 12 presenting sponsor, the high jewelry maison Van Cleef & Arpels. Since its founding in Paris's Place Vendôme in 1906, Van Cleef & Arpels has developed a distinctive blend of poetry and refinement. With its jewelry and watchmaking collections, the Maison is an invitation to a timeless universe of beauty and harmony. You can discover more at vancleefarpels.com. That's VANCLEEFARPELS.com. And thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of Time Sensitive on our website, timesensitive.fm, or wherever you listen to podcasts. To keep up with our latest time-sensitive episodes and get behind-the-scenes updates, sign up for our newsletter at slowdown.media/newsletter. That's slowdown.media/newsletter. You can follow us on Instagram at slowdown.media. Our theme music was composed by Billy Martin. This episode was produced by Ramon Broza, Olivia Almer, Mimi Hannon, and Johnny Simon.